All right, thank you very much. I direct the outreach and engagement for CRCL. I'm glad to see so many familiar and also new faces in the audience. So I think we did something right today, at least. I'm going to go ahead and switch gears just a bit here and kind of really talk about what everything we've seen really means for our residents and for our communities, and not just for you sitting here in this room today, but really for the next generations to come. And I'm glad that we have some of the 300 participants here as well, because this really is going to be their challenge and their task to lead the way into our future. So we've seen some really good information so far. We've seen the trajectory of land loss. We've lost a lot of land. We know that we're going to continue to have challenges and lose more land in certain areas of our coast. We also know that we have a strategy, the multiple lines of defense strategy, that's going to help us to be able to work, live, and play in certain areas of the coast into the future. And while there is uncertainty with sea level rise, as it was touched on earlier, we are very fortunate to have the master plan process that is this living document, this living process that is able to manage that uncertainty and still take action to address these challenges into the future. And so if we think about that future, and if the master plan is fully funded and fully implemented in 50 years, we can envision that the coast may look a little something like this. And what you see here is in the darker shades of green, those are wetlands that are sustained as a result of the master plan. The lighter green is new wetlands that are created through sediment diversions, marsh creation projects. And all of the red lines on there represent the levees. The dotted ones are planned levees. The solid ones are levees that are already constructed. But we do need to make sure that we have to maintain and continue to fund those levees. Otherwise, they don't give us the protection that they currently do. And so what does this future really mean for our communities? And specifically, what does this mean for flooding? So we have I'm going to show 3 images that show current flood risk and how that flood risk can change into the future. So first off, this is current day. The darker greens, the darker blues in here represent the greatest depths of flood, and that's actually 15 feet or greater of flood depths. And this is what would occur if a 100-year storm event or a significant hurricane hit at any given point along that coast. And so the lightest shades of green, still stuck on those greens, the lightest shades of blue are 3 feet or less. So if we see how this changes into the future with that master plan fully funded and implemented, you clearly see a lot more dark blue that shows up along the coast. So I'll go back one more just so you can kind of see that change. And while it is unfortunate that this is the reality that we face, that even as we address this issue as best we can, that we still have more flooding that will occur into the future. If we compare that, though, with what would happen if we sat on our hands and did not do anything, you could clearly see how much more of the coast gets covered in a significant hurricane event. So that's with the plan, and that's if we don't take action. So if this is the future that we face with the plan fully implemented and funded, we could see in this image really 2 of the 3 components of the multiple lines of defense strategy. So in the green shades is the result of restoration projects being implemented on our landscape. The other component shown here is the structural protection, so the levees, floodgates, and that's all depicted in red. What's not clearly visible in here is that the third leg of that stool, the third piece, the non-structural. And really we need to think about non-structural as what individuals can do and different actions that can be taken at the local level or regional level to really help us address this increased flood risk that we're anticipating. And so while Bren did touch on the master plan and the non-structural component of that, this gets a little bit deeper into it. So at the top of there, we have a map that outlines in the 2017 master plan all of the different project areas where non-structural is recommended. So this is over 32 different projects. Within that, as Bren mentioned, there's 3 main types of actions that are being planned for in this arena. So flood proofing of non-residential, elevating residential, and then voluntary acquisition of residential structures as well. And that's all depending on the anticipated flood depths. And the shading in all of those project areas is basically showing the number of structures that's recommended. And this accounts for over $6 billion in the master plan. Now, this is great. This is a great goal and a target for us to have. But as Bren mentioned, the funding that is currently available is largely tied to restoration projects. So there isn't a giant pot of money sitting to start doing these projects. And really, if we really want to think about what resilient communities look like, and by resilient I mean communities that are not only able to rebound from a hurricane or a flood event, but communities that are able to thrive into that future landscape. That really encompasses more than just this, and really it's more than what's in the scope of what CPRA it has to do. And this has to do, again, with actions that can be taken at the local level by parish governments and individuals. And so what we really need to be planning for is how populations are going to be changing, how communities are going to be changing, and we actually have already seen a little bit of this change. So in this map here, this is based off of census data from 2000 to 2010, and it shows how populations are moving, and this is largely correlated with increased flood risk. So you see in the larger circles means more of a population shift, red means people are leaving, green means people are coming. And so in communities that are in very low-lying areas like way south in Plaquemines and Buras, or in Lafitte that are outside of federal levees, we've seen a significant decrease in the populations. In other areas that are on high ground, such as Mandeville and Beta Springs, we've seen significant increases. And more than just people moving, what often occurs with this is that people with resources that have the means to leave are the ones that are taking these actions and making these decisions on their own. And when that happens, in the red communities, it starts to drain some of the resources that are there. You start to lose some of the social services, such as healthcare, grocery stores, and things like that. And what's happening in the green areas, if this isn't really very thoughtfully planned and prepared, is that you end up having kind of a surge of population, which then puts a strain on the resources that are there. So infrastructure and stormwater management and things like that become an increasing concern. And so I'm going to highlight two examples that kind of give a little bit more meat to this change that is occurring, and really forward thinking of how we can anticipate that these changes are going to occur, but how do we really prepare and plan for that so that we can have those resilient communities moving forward. The first effort is Resilient New Orleans. Now, Resilient New Orleans is a strategy to really envision, we're celebrating the 300th anniversary of New Orleans. If we want to celebrate the 600th anniversary, I know that's a considerable time away. What do we really need to start doing now in order to prepare for that? And so the city of New Orleans got some funding through the Rockefeller Foundation, and they were one of the first what's called the 100 Resilient Cities. And Rockefeller around the world has identified urban centers that are challenged by changing environmental conditions. And New Orleans was fortunate enough to be selected. And with that, funding came to basically create a resilient office of resiliency, and this Resilient New Orleans strategy. And in those lovely colored boxes there, that's the three visions that the strategy embraces. So adapt to thrive, you could really think about that as embracing the changing coast and the changing climate. So as if any of you have been in the city in the past couple of weeks, we are seeing increased flood events that pop up out of nowhere that are really taxing on our stormwater management systems. So how do we improve that? How do we work towards being able to handle that capacity better into the future? Connect to opportunity. So making sure that we have equitable access to housing and employment and jobs into the future. Transform city systems. To me, that screams our public transit. How do we make sure that people can get where they need to go in a more effective and efficient manner? And to give one kind of concrete example of what all of this may look like and a project that has already occurred, in this image right here, this is a retention pond that was constructed, and there was a culvert that was placed in the sidewalk. So if you would imagine, just as we had a couple of a week or two ago, a very heavy, quick downpour that saturates and floods the city streets and overwhelms the drainage system. What this enables is when the water is flooding into the street and the drain is backed up, it's able to bypass the drain, go underneath the sidewalk, and fill into this ponding area there. And so not only does this help with the flooding issue, when it's dry, it's a recreational space. It also adds, some aesthetic beautification to the neighborhood, and the wetland grasses and the fact that this exists in a neighborhood helps to connect these flooding issues to tangible solutions that we need to be embracing and employing. The next effort that I'm going to talk about is the LA SAFE, Louisiana Strategic Adaptations for Future Environments. This was a community planning effort that was done by the Office of Community Development with significant support from Foundation for Louisiana. And through this effort, 6 parishes, and residents rather, of 6 parishes were engaged over a very lengthy kind of planning and envisioning process. This was St. Tammany, St. John the Baptist, Terrebonne, Lafourche, Jefferson, and Plaquemines. And really, through this process, thinking back to that map that I showed where the populations are shifting, realizing that into the future, we're gonna have different risk areas of flooding. So we have, we're gonna have low risk areas like those green circles that I showed before. We're gonna have high risk areas like the red circles, and then we're gonna have moderate. And so how do we really plan appropriately for this risk that we anticipate into the future so that we can have resilient and thriving communities in these areas? And so I'll spend just a moment to touch on so the community members came to several meetings and they were asked to contribute their vision of if you were in a high, low, or medium risk area, what would your vision of that community be into the future that is a wonderful place that you want to continue to live and play, work, etc. So in low risk areas, we would expect that the green circles, these are going to be areas where populations are going to be moving to. So we're going to have denser residential housing. And with denser residential housing means that there's going to be more paving of green space. So then with that, we're going to have better, improved stormwater management. But we want to also maintain green space and other services like transportation. In medium risk areas, these are areas that are, you could think of that for a kind of an average storm or an average hurricane or a smaller hurricane, that these will still be protected and they won't necessarily flood in a general flood event. But these are areas that will still likely flood if they get hit by a significant hurricane. And so we want to make sure that we have elevated transportation routes in these areas. We want to make sure that if populations do start to shift somewhat, that we maintain those key services like grocery stores, health, and recreation. And we want to make sure that we also have appropriate jobs and housing in those areas. In the high-risk areas, we can anticipate that these are going to be areas that are going to flood when we have just almost a tropical storm sometimes, like we have seen in some of our low-lying areas already in coastal Louisiana. But although these places will still flood, people need to work here in these places. We have a lot of economies that are directly tied to the resources and these environments that are very close to the Gulf. So if people still need to work in these areas, how do we make sure that it's safe for them to do so? How do we realize that we need to have housing and plan for housing that is hardened, that's going to stand up to a hurricane, and anticipate that a hurricane is going to push some water into these communities. People are going to need to evacuate and get to safety. But how do we make sure that people can return back to their communities, have elevated houses that are above the floodwaters, and get back to a sense of normalcy of life as quickly as possible? So although we do have some challenges that lie ahead, I hope that it's been communicated that we do have some hope with the strategies that have been outlined, with the projects that are planned. we have a mechanism to deal with this uncertainty. We really need to be challenging ourselves to think long term, to think not just about our kids and grandkids, but even further down the road than that. And I know that's difficult to do with day-to-day problems and issues, but for the safety and sake of the future of this coast that we want everyone to be able to continue to enjoy, these are the challenges that we need to tackle. And so I'll just leave you with this reminder of the multiple lines of defense strategy, and with this charge for action. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Corey Miller. Any questions for Corey before we take our break? There's a couple.
Thank you. When you mentioned about the infiltration rates and so forth, and this Rockefeller grant, I'm curious, is there any money inside that grant for code enforcement in New Orleans, which would help in terms of people not paving over? You know, there are codes about how much a home, an area can actually pave,
Yeah.
et cetera.
So that strategy, the I guess brilliant thing about it is there was a lot of work that was done prior to the strategy. So I don't know if you're familiar with the urban water plan, which is basically how do we really live with water in the city, which makes a lot of recommendations for incentivizing permeable pavement and things like that. So this strategy has adopted the work that came before it, but then also has created the space to incorporate new efforts that are coming after it. As far as the specific funding, I am not sure on that. I can get back to you though.
Yeah, I was just hoping you could speak to some specific examples of projects that CRCL has worked on to address the issues you've talked about. So first and foremost, we pull together events like this. We try to make sure that communities are educated and knowledgeable about the challenges that they face into the future. We do have a volunteer restoration program where we engage volunteers to do everything from plant cypress trees to marsh grasses to put up sand fences and do dune restoration. We also have an oyster shell recycling program where we build living shoreline projects. So we do work on the ground. We do realize, though, that in the grand scheme of things, that these projects are small. And so we really focus on the educational and kind of acknowledgement of these issues to get more people involved.
I've got a question on this side.
Yep.
Somebody?
Sorry. Oh, we
Nobody?
have one on.
Oh, he's got. We'll get this one and then we'll.
Thank you, sir.
The Gentilly? So as in the same process or I guess effort that provided the funding for the LA Safe, the City of New Orleans was also a recipient of this grant funding. And within that, there's the Gentilly Resilience District that has been planned. And so that outlines several different projects, such as in more of those rain garden or rather retention pond projects. And so I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for in that, but the lady sitting right in front of you can definitely give you more detail than I can.
Hi, Corey.
Yes.
Anthropologist here. Always nice to meet another social scientist. So, everything you've talked about is terrific and vital. And I loved your example of having the communities provide their vision of how their neighborhood has to change to respond to their risk level. But at the same time, what is going to be required, in my mind, is massive fundamental cultural change. People are going to have to expect a different look, a different feel for their city than the way people in our culture generally think of a city looking and feeling. We're going to have to relearn how to live with water. And I'm curious if you have thoughts, or if anyone else does, on how we can make that happen in a way that's productive but also equitable. So it's not coming top down so much as laterally, if you follow me.
Yeah. So one thing I failed to mention with that LA Safe project, it wasn't simply a planning project. There is a significant amount of money that is going to actually put projects in each of those 6 parishes. I think first and foremost, though, we need to continue to educate our friends, neighbors, and I mean, it's great that everyone is in here. I wish that we would have had to have pulled in another third of this crowd to accommodate even a larger audience in here. So the education is really key, and being just upfront and frank and talking about these problems and challenges.